Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPTEL course on materials informatics. In this lecture we will look at language models. So just as a recap of what we discussed in the last lecture, we looked at some generative models that can be used for structure generation or enumeration in material science. We looked at how classical models sort of work such as variational autoencoders. The more modern cutting edge models use diffusion. And in diffusion you sort of learn probability distributions associated with noising denoising processes, right, that go from your actual representation of your structure to your latent space representation. And diffusion models can be quite powerful, and they are the ones that are used in modern generative tools. So in this lecture we look at how language models work in general, what are some of the changes to neural network architectures that power the large language models that are quite commonly used within the common literature now, and how they can be applied to some specific material science tasks such as structure generation. The schematics that I will be using are derived from one of these 6 resources unless otherwise mentioned. Okay. So if you look at conventional neural networks such as dense neural networks or even convolutional neural networks, they are sort of limited by how much they can actually sort of learn, and that is largely dependent on their input and output dimensions, right. So if you look at a simple convolutional neural network, the sort of input image dimension is usually fixed, right, and the output dimensions are also fixed. So it sort of predicts an output of certain dimensions, or it does a classification task. So it does a classification of whether an image is a tree or not tree, something like that, right. So the input and output dimensions are fixed, and this sort of limits the extent of learning, right, and the way it limits is you can only do sort of one-to-one mapping or one-to-one associations among your input and outputs, right. So if you put in an image of a tree, right, which is one input, right, you can basically get the representation of a tree or a classification of a tree as your output, right. So a tree image is basically mapped to a it is a tree or not tree kind of an output here, but you do not have other ways of or other associations that are possible. So for example, you cannot say that a tree is in a forest, for example. So if you give it an image of a tree, it is not trivial for a simple convolutional network to generate an image of a forest, for example. We cannot classify different types of trees very trivially, right. So usually these regular neural networks, so both dense neural networks as well as one-to-one neural networks, dense neural networks as well as convolutional neural networks have one-to-one mapping, right, between your inputs and outputs. And there is also sort of no persistence or context in terms of predictions, in the sense that these neural networks do not really remember what kind of data that they saw before. So they are always focused on what data they are actually seeing currently. So for instance, let us say you are letting a simple convolutional neural network or a dense neural network model to watch a movie. It will be very difficult for that model to predict what the next scene would be, right, whereas humans can, right. So especially movies that are that follow a certain template, right. So we can almost always predict what the next scenes are going to be, how this character is going to evolve and so on, right. So this is an ability that humans have, and humans have this ability because we have persistence. So we do take into account all the movies that we have seen before. We have seen different character evolutions before. So all that information is stored right within our brain, within our neural networks, and that gives us context to sort of predict what is going to happen in a scenario that is very similar to what we have seen before, right. So this kind of context based or memory based predictions is very difficult for conventional neural networks, right. And this limitation sort of extends especially if you want to model languages, right. So in languages you have sentences that are of different lengths, right, you have paragraphs that are of different lengths, and you have entire textbooks, right, that are of different lengths, right. So you basically have if you were to characterize your input, let's say you are trying to model a book, right, you are trying to teach a neural network model how to read a book, right. Now you would like to model you would like to teach a model that can learn multiple books at the same time. So or in other words, you would like to teach a model how to read a book once and hope that it can actually read different books with the same ability, right. So you don't want a model to break down if the, let's say if the book that you trained it on has 1000 pages, right. You don't want the model to break down if you suddenly expose it to a book that only has 300 pages or one that has 2000 pages, right. So you would want a model that is general enough that can treat input data of different dimensions, right. So we can sort of think of language inputs as basically sequences, right. So what are sequences? So each word, and normally word is also referred to as a token, right. So each word in a sentence is basically a vector, so you can have a unique vectorial representation of each word, right. So there are mathematical ways of representing this. So any given word, so the word can be of different number of characters by itself. So one word can have 10 characters, one word can have 100 characters. 100 character words are not very common, but let's say one word can have 5 characters, one word can have 10 characters. But you can take these words and then represent them as vectors of the same dimension, right. So think of this as translating simple words into some kind of a vectorial space, a numerical high dimensional space, right. So you can always transpose a word into a vector, but when you have a sentence is basically a collection of these vectors, right, and this collection of vectors is basically referred to as a sequence, right. So in language models we basically have to ensure that we can deal with sequences of different lengths, right. So we cannot always expect sentences to only have 5 words or only have 10 words and so on, right. So the input for models that can process language should be able to deal with varying sequences of vectors, right. So varying lengths or varying collections of vectors. And the other sort of nice thing about nice or a requirement of modeling languages is that each word can have multiple associations that are possible to it, right. So for example, if you look at the word of a king, right, king refers to a male person, right, king also refers to an authoritative person, and king is also associated with the throne that he wears, right. So and in terms of geography, the king probably rules over a certain region, right, of space, right. So you see that the word king has several possible associations, right. And it is important for language models to understand these different associations. So we cannot just say that a king just means a male person, but a king also wears a throne. So both of them have to be associated, right, with the word king. So multiple associations are possible within languages, and we need to capture these associations as well as possible, right. And the other sort of nice thing is, once we figure out how to sort of deal with sequences in general, right, we can also use this framework to deal with sequences to model fixed inputs also, such as images, right. So usually when we build models for handling images, we build them for an input image dimension for input images of certain dimensions of certain number of pixels, right. But we can also deal with these fixed inputs, so where images are all of the same number of pixels, we can also deal with this in terms of sequences, right. So where the models can sort of identify which region of the image is very important for a given classification task or a regression task, right. So if we look at this MNIST data set, right, so we can actually treat the 784 pixels as as a sequence as well, as a sequence of 784 one dimensional vectors, and the model should sort of can try and understand which regions of the image are actually important, right, in trying to make predictions of what is the actual number that they actually see, right. So fixed inputs can also be converted to sequences as well. So as long as we can construct a neural network framework that can model sequences, they can be used for multiple tasks as well. Okay. So just to sort of visualize associations between input and output, so the green blocks here basically refer to some kind of neural network or learning architecture. The red blocks are your inputs and the blue blocks are your outputs. So in conventional neural networks, you typically have this kind of an association. So you have an input that is directly associated with one output. So you have a one-to-one sort of association. But there are several other associations that are possible, right. So one input can be associated to several outputs. So a king can be associated to being a male person, to being a person with power, and to being a person who wears a throne, right. You can also have many words associated to one. So you can have let us say for example for an output of a dog, you can say that no, dog has ears, dog has teeth, and dog has a mouth, right. So all these words can be associated to a dog, right. You can have many to many associations as well. So you can say that there is a male person with power and a king is associated with a person who wears a throne, person who rules over a region, and a person who is probably married to a queen, right. So you can have many to many associations as well, right, and many to many can be asymmetric in nature. So these can be sort of sequential in nature. So these three contribute, these three inputs contribute to these three outputs in the sequential manner. This can also be in parallel, right. So these three outputs these three inputs all influence the three different outputs, right. So here there is more sort of sequential kind of relationship, this is more kind of a parallel relationship. So you can have several possible associations between your inputs and your outputs, and you would want your green blocks, your models, to basically be able to handle these different associations. Okay, so one of the ways that we can actually handle multiple associations and build in some kind of memory or persistence within neural networks is to use this framework called recurrent neural networks. So wherein we have a neural network model that takes in inputs, right. So the T basically refers to time or some kind of an increment. So as T varies, your inputs are varying, and it makes some output predictions as well, but then it keeps sort of learning or updating whatever it knows about its previous inputs as well. So it builds into account some kind of a looping infrastructure here. So if we were to unravel this loop, right. So let us say your model saw some initial input, it learned to make an output prediction, but it also made sure that this information was passed on to a successor model. Right. So this can be the same model whose weights and biases are updated, or this can be a truly successor model which is a copy of this model, and the weights and biases of this model or the embeddings that this model generates can be updated based on the history as well as the new inputs, right. So if we do this multiple times, you see that some information from the past or some memory sort of persists through the model along with making predictions on whatever new inputs it is actually seeing, right. So this kind of information being passed down sort of builds in some kind of memory or context within whatever information that the model is seeing at its current instance, right. So this is what makes RNNs different from our regular dense neural networks or convolutional neural networks. And given this type of persistence of information, we can now see that we can either perform one-to-one associations or many-to-many associations as well. So your first input can still be sort of tied to this final output here, right. So your first input can be related to this output, so these two can be associated. Your second input can also be associated, third input can be associated, and vice versa. Your first input is anyways associated to your first output, your first input is also associated with your second output, and so on. So you see that many inputs are associated with many outputs with this recurrent neural network architecture. Okay, and recurrent neural networks can actually be quite useful. So these are examples of image tasks, right. So you see that the images here basically represent some kind of house numbers, right, and these are all fixed pixel images, so the number of pixels are the same, but you see that the model is actually learning the important pieces of the image as it tries to reconstruct whatever is the house number, right. So you see that it's sort of scanning through only the relevant portions of the image to generate the final kind of output. Here is another example where sort of given an image, the model tries to identify not just the housing number but also the color, the paint associated with that housing number. So these are sort of simple image tasks where recurrent neural networks have been shown to be quite useful. But recurrent neural networks also have problems in terms of long-term persistence. So what I mean by that is, so let us say you have very long sentences or associations that come in very late compared to what information that model has seen before. The model can still have problems ensuring that they remember all that information. So I will give a couple of examples, right. So let us say you have a simple sentence of the clouds are in the sky. So here you want the association between the word clouds and the sky. So you want the model to understand that clouds are present in the sky. So these two are the most important words within this sentence, right. Now this maybe the recurrent neural network does not have a problem, right. So clouds is the second word that it has seen and sky is the sixth word that it has seen. So it should probably be able to make the association with the second word and the sixth word, right. But let us say you expose it to a fairly long sentence or a series of sentences, right. So this refers to someone who grew up in France, they went to school, they played football and so on. So there is a whole description of what they have done and then they suddenly say that I am fluent in French, right. Now in order for the model to understand that the fact that this person is fluent in French is associated with the fact that they actually grew up in France, this association may be very difficult for the model because there is a series of redundant information, right, that the model has seen which is not related to this language and this region, right. So by the time the model actually sees this fact that I am fluent in French, it would have forgotten the fact that this person grew up in France, right. So if you have associations that are very long ranged in nature, this model or a simple recurrent neural network may actually forget such associations, right. So sort of long term memory or long term persistence can be a problem when you use simple recurrent neural networks. So one solution to fixing this memory problem is basically use a memory network. So these are called long short term memory networks or LSTM networks. So basically these networks try to remember important information as long as possible, right. So let us look at how these LSTM blocks work. So instead of having a simple sort of output of your predecessor model feeding into feeding as input to your successor model, these LSTM models have a few changes in the architectural design. So you see that they have introduced several different blocks or mathematical operations that takes into account input, output from your previous model and then tries to make a prediction of your output. I know this block looks quite complicated, so let us try to decompose this into the elementary steps. And the focus of LSTM is to keep the important information for as long as possible and forget unnecessary information. So that is why it tries to remember as much of important information as long as possible. So we can sort of decompose this LSTM blocks into 5 different blocks. The first one is what is referred to as the cell state, right. So this basically is this set of information that is passed on through your network with minimal changes. So it is not like this information cannot be changed, but this information is persistent throughout your neural network block, right. So this helps in the long range memory basically. So you have a memory that is created, the memory can be modified to some extent as it goes through the different blocks, but that memory stays the same, right, until the eventual final output. And then you have a set of gates, a mathematical operation that lets you forget unimportant information and then keep newly seen important information. So for example, if you have a sentence where there are multiple subjects, right. So the sentence could be something like there were animals in the farm, one of the animals that was seen was a chicken and chicken lays eggs, right. So let us say you have 3 series of sentences. The first set of subjects that the model saw was actually animals, right? So there were animals in the farm, and then the second sentence that it saw was one of the most important animals in the farm is chicken, right. So chicken is the second subject, which implies that the following sentences are probably going to be about chickens, right. So we do not have to remember the fact that there were animals in the farm as much, right. So we can actually forget some old subjects within the sentence that are actually not relevant, and this forget gate helps the model forget unimportant information. So the input gate basically helps the model learn about new information that are probably important, such as chickens are the most important animal, right, in the farm. So this helps the model sort of learn new information, and once the new information is learnt and the old information is forgotten, it is then used to update the cell state, right. So the state of the cell that is actually passed on through the subsequent blocks as well. And then each block of the model can also give an output. The output is basically this cell state information which is passed through a certain kind of a filter, right. The output can be about the new subject that has learnt. So we learned that the chickens are a very important animal of the farm. Now we can say whether chicken is singular or plural. Are we referring to one single chick or multiple chicken, right? And if we also learn that chickens lay eggs, then we can think about, okay, does one chicken lay one egg, or does one chicken lay multiple eggs, and so on. So singular, plural, gender information and any other contextual information that may be useful can all be outputted through this filtering process here, right. So there are all simple mathematical matrix operations that are performed here. We won't get into the details of the mathematical operations, but the crux is this. So there is a cell state that is sort of passed through the network. At each block you basically forget unimportant information, keep useful information, and then you update your cell state using these unimportant and useful information, and then each block can also output certain filtered information about certain filtered information, which is a combination of your old information as well as your new information, right. So it can output a certain filtered state, right. And then eventually if this process is done multiple times, the eventual output can be quite useful to us, right, which can hopefully make multiple associations with whatever inputs we give it, right. And this is just one variant of LSTM networks. There are several variants that are possible. Again, in the interest of time, we won't go into the different variants that are possible. So LSTMs are quite good in fixing the memory problem, but they have some limitations also. So for instance, LSTM sort of do sequential processing. So they see one word at a time in a given sentence, and this is usually quite slow in terms of training, and this really limits scaling up of the model to very large data sets. So if you only had books that were 100 pages or 200 pages, maybe 1000 words, 2000 words, and so on, maybe LSTM models are good. They will still be able to retain associations with one word at a time, learning one word at a time over these small books, right. But if you were to train a model on the entire internet or the entire Wikipedia, then you are looking at billions of words very easily, billions or even trillions of words very easily, and these models will not be able to scale up to such large data sets, and they will have difficulties in keeping up or remembering the context over very large data sets. So this sequential processing can lead to both slow training and limit how easily these models can actually scale up to very large data sets. And because these models do sequential processing, so they learn about one word at a time, there is also an information bottleneck. So there is limited amount of information or knowledge that these models can actually pass from one layer to another, right. And for very long range dependencies, you can actually have this problem of either vanishing gradients or exploding gradients. So if you have associations between two words that happen over very large distances, by distance I mean there are a lot of words in between before an association is made, then the original word can gradually lose context, or the model may think that it is fairly unimportant, so it may be associated with very vanishing gradients, right. So this kind of a vanishing as well as exploding gradients can be a problem whenever you have very long range dependencies within these LSTM models, right. So the solution to the limitations of these LSTM models is to basically use what is referred to as a transformer architecture. This is a schematic of a transformer architecture, and it is these transformers that actually power many of these large language models that you actually see in common use now, such as GPT and BERT. So let us look at what these transformers do, right. So transformers are basically encoder decoder models. These are deep learning models, so they have multiple layers within them, and they try to map one input sequence into multiple output sequences. So they try to generate these many to many associations. So what do these encoders and decoders do? So the encoder here tries to map an input sequence into some kind of a contextual representation. So it tries to represent this input sequence into some sort of high dimensional mathematical space, but with context retained. So it tries to understand the importance of each word in a given sentence. The decoder basically tries to decode whatever information this encoder gives it. So it tries to generate an output token, an output word, based on whatever the encoder is giving it, right. So whatever representation the encoder is giving it, the decoder tries to generate an output, right. And transformers typically stack multiple encoders and multiple decoders. and you can have sort of each encoder here passing on its output to all or one of these decoders here, right. So that is also possible, and this is one way of passing information from encoding to decoding, right. So you typically stack in multiple encoders and then multiple decoders. So let us say your input is, let us say this is a translation model and your input is a French sentence here, the Je suis student, sorry, Je suis étudiant, and the output would be I am a student, right, once you translate. So this encodes your French representation, and the decoder basically does the translation and puts together words in the English language. The key to why transformers actually work is because they use what is referred to as an attention mechanism, right. So for every word in a sentence, it tries to provide some kind of a context to that word, and we look at the utility of attention in the next few slides. Transformers are parallelizable and they are also quite scalable models, so they can process multiple words at a time. So LSTM models can only process one word at a time, but transformers can basically take in entire sentences or entire paragraphs and then process them in one go. So they are highly parallelizable, and because they can process multiple words at a time, they are also very scalable. The encoder does pass messages on to decoding, so you have some kind of message passing or passing of context, right. So when the decoder actually works or generates outputs, it tries to preserve these contexts. And they also use what is referred to as multi-head attention, and this multi-head attention allows these models to create multiple contexts for a given word, right. So for example, again if you think of the word of king, king has a context or association with man, king has an association with throne, and king has association with power, right. So it tries to create all of these multiple associations within the words that it actually comes across in a sentence or in a paragraph. And these transformers also take into account the words themselves and also their position in a given sentence. So these are actually treated separately. So when it tries to get the context of different words, it just gets the words by themselves without necessarily understanding their order, but then it also tries to preserve their order in a sentence by understanding where these words are positioned, so that when the decoder works, it sort of understands where to position a given word that it is trying to output, right. So these models take into account both the words themselves and also their positions within a given sentence. So that is briefly how these transformers work. These are mathematically quite complex objects, but we will try to just understand how these work in a big picture perspective. Okay. So I mentioned that attention is the heart of why transformers work very well. So let us try to understand what I mean by attention. So if you look at this sentence, right, that she is eating a green apple, right, we see that the word eating has a very strong association with the word apple, right. This is natural for us because when someone is eating, the eating process must be associated with the food, right. So if you want your model to generate this sentence, right, in a sequential manner, if you expose your model to she is eating a green, for example, you would want the model to generate apple as your output token, in the hope that apple has been associated with eating, right, before. So you need a high degree of association between your eating and your apple, which is what is referred to as high attention here, right. Whereas these two words, right, eating and green, or green and apple, have low associations. So a person can eat a red apple, right, a person can also eat a different colored food, right. So the word green has or should have less context or less attention with respect to the word eating or with respect to the word apple, right. So so it is important for us to or for the model to understand which words have high degrees of association, and that is what attention tries to capture, right. So it provides context to which words are important in a given sentence. If you look at a different sentence here, so this basically says that no, the animal did not cross the street because it was too tired, right. The word it can now correspond to several different subjects, right. So it can correspond to animal, it can also correspond to street here, right. But when you use attention, you hope it to identify that it is not the street that is most important, it is actually the animal that is most important, or it is basically associated with the animal in this sentence more than the street in this sentence, right. So this is what you would like to capture when you put in attention, right, or this is or this is what attention does. So it provides context between different words in a given sentence. So how does attention actually work, right. So it actually works on simple, again, mathematical operations, and it uses 3 key variables called query, key and value. So basically if you multiply your input embeddings of a given word with your query matrix, the resultant vector that you get is basically your query. Same thing if you do it with respect to your key matrix, the resultant you get is a key. So this is basically the query of thinking, this is basically a key of thinking, and same thing if you do it with respect to the value matrix, you get your value of thinking, right. And these matrices are all learnt. So these are all learnt by the attention model when it is being trained. So what is the purpose of these 3 these 3 matrices or variables? So query basically corresponds to what am I looking for, right. So what is the context that I am looking for in a given sentence for a given word, right. Key basically encodes whatever information I have within my sentence, so whatever I have seen so far, what information does that add up to, and value basically determines what should I output, right. So given that I am looking for something and I know something, what should I be outputting, right, in terms of my output. So what attention tries to do is basically it tries to calculate query, key and value matrices, right, for each word in a given sentence, right. So for each word it tries to basically provide the context of that word with respect to all the other words in a sentence, and it tries to make a prediction or an output for a new word depending on what are the previous words that it has seen and their respective associations. So how do we actually quantify the similarity of words? So let us say you are looking for something, you are looking for an association with query, and this is the information that you already have, which is the key. If you actually take a simple dot product between your query and key, then that should give you the similarity, right, between your query and key. So if the dot product is if you think about simple dot products between vectors, if the dot product is close to 1, then the vectors are overlapping with one another, they are in the same direction. If the dot product is 0, then they are orthogonal to one another, right. Very similar mathematical idea here. So if your query has a high degree of relevance to whatever given information, given key that you have, then the dot product should have a high value. If it is not, then the dot product should have a very low value, right. So once again we can look at this in terms of a heat map. So let us say this is your input sentence and this is your translated sentence. So this is in French and this is in English. If your model actually learnt the context of words very well, right, it would output an association matrix or a query times your key matrix of this form, right, between these 2 sentences. So for example, accord in French refers to agreement, so you see that agreement and accord have high degree of association. Zone economic European basically refers to the European economic area, so you see that this region has high degree of association, European economic area here, right. And then outh basically refers to August, right. So that is why you have a high degree of association, and 1992 basically refers to 1992, right. So those 2 again have a high degree of association. So the whiter blocks basically indicate which words are similar or which words are highly associated between your input and your target, your output or your translated version, right. So you first identify whatever similarity you are looking for with the information you have. So that is this process here. You then scale this information to make sure that you solve the problem of vanishing or exploding gradients or vanishing or exploding gradients during back propagation. You also pass it through a softmax function so that your output is always scaled, right, and then whatever your output is, right, you then multiply that to a value, right, so that you determine what value you should actually be outputting or what word you should be outputting given you have seen some amount of words in your input, right. So this q times k is basically refers to as raw attention score. This is scaled and passed through a softmax function so that its output is standardized, output is normalized, and then it's multiplied to a value here, right, value matrix here, so that you get your final output. Okay, so we can also visualize this math of attention here. So just as a context, so if you compute a value, an output based on this kind of a mathematical operation, so q times k softmax and then you multiply it with v, this process is basically referred to as self attention, right. So self attention, it's called self attention because it provides context to a given word in a given sentence, and it does this process for all the words in a given sentence, right. So this process is referred to as self attention. So you can also visualize the math of this attention process. So we can say that there are two words, thinking and machines here, which are represented by some kind of embeddings here, and then you generate a corresponding query key value. You multiply the query and key, you get a certain value, you then scale it and then put it through a softmax function which should give it a value between 0 and 1, and then softmax multiplied with your value, this is your value matrix here, should give you two values for, so this is value for thinking with itself and this is the value of thinking with machines, right, with the adjacent word. You then take the two values that you got and then you sum up to get the final sort of representation of your thinking. So this is the representation with attention, right, of thinking, and if you do the same process for machines you get Z2 for machines, right. So q1 times, so we say q1 times k1 here, so this is the key corresponding to thinking, this is key corresponding to machines here, right. So we are looking at similarity between thinking and machines here, right. Okay, so this is briefly how sort of self attention works. And the other sort of nice thing with attention that is usually implemented in transformers is that it also ends up refining the original embeddings that you use to represent your input data. So for example, let us say this was your original sentence, a fluffy blue creature roamed the verdant forest, right. Initially you may have a representation for this fluffy itself, so this would actually be represented in a mathematical vector, but I am just showing a graphical form here. So you would have a representation for fluffy, you would have a representation for blue, you would have a representation for creature, right. But with attention you can actually combine all these three words to represent a fluffy blue creature, right. So you can create a common set of embeddings that represents these three words coming together in a given sentence. Same thing with verdant and forest. Verdant basically says that something is greenish, forest is a collection of dense collection of trees, and then verdant and forest you can basically combine and say that it's a green forest, right. So these kinds of associated embeddings can be generated when you use attention in the transformer architecture. Okay. And within a given transform architecture there are actually multiple types of attention that are actually used. So we saw an example of self attention, right. So you can use self attention in each of the encoder blocks within your transformer architecture. You can also modify the self attention to have what is referred to as a multi-head attention. We will see what is multi-head attention in the next slide. So in the encoder blocks you basically use attention to contextualize information, right, and in the decoder blocks you basically use the same attention block but you use masking techniques. So for example, let us say this is the original sentence that you have, the FBI is chasing a criminal on the run, you give selected portions of the same sentence during decoding so that the sort of model understands what is the importance of each of the words and how one word is related to the previous words that it has actually seen, right. So for example, if you say the FBI is chasing, the model should understand that chasing is being done by FBI, so it should have a high degree of association between FBI and chasing, and then eventually when it sees chasing a criminal it should have a high degree of association between chasing and criminal. So the criminal is the one who is being chased, right, by the FBI here, right. So the decoder basically you do this masking technique, so you mask individual words one at a time, or you mask different phrases within a given sentence so that the decoder sort of understands the context that is being sent to it by the encoder itself, right. So and masking is also very useful to create robust models, particularly for generative tasks, right. So when you do generation you actually truly do not know what is going to be the upcoming sentence, so you want a model to be able to predict words in the right manner. So masking is a very useful technique to create fairly stable generative models. So apart from this self attention or multi-head attention and masking, right, in the encoder and decoder blocks, the transformer can also use in cross attention, right, wherein it can take the key and value matrices from one encoder and then combine it with a query matrix from a previous decoder. So you have decoders that are being stacked, you take a query from your previous decoder, right, and then you take into account encoders, you take into account the key and value matrices from your corresponding encoder, and you combine all three. So you combine k and v from an encoder and q from a previous decoder to get an output of your current decoder. So you can also have cross attention like this to basically give better context or pass in information in a more efficient fashion. So sort of last conceptual thing on how actually multi-head attention works, right. So we saw how self attention works, so that is to provide one kind of context or one kind of information about a certain collection of words. Now the same sentence or the same collection of words may have multiple possible associations with it, right. So for example, if you think about a word that says the king is a man with a lot of power who wears a throne, right, maybe if you did one amount of attention, you only get a strong association between king and a man, right, but you also want an association with the fact that the king is also a man who wears a throne and who wields a lot of power, right. So this kind of multiple association or multiple relationships between words, right, can be obtained if you use what is referred to as multi-head attention. So what you basically do is you pass in the same set of inputs, your words, right, but then you create multiple copies of your query key and value matrices in the hope that you get multiple different associations with the same set of words that you actually see, right. So you get a different set of weights for your query key and value in this head here, you get other sets of query key value associations here and so on. So maybe here you get the association that king is a man, here you get an association that king wears a throne, and here you get an association that king has power, right. You then find a way to represent all of this in your embedding space, and finally you actually just concatenate all of your embedding space so that there is no loss in information, and you pass it to some kind of a feed forward neural network which is usually dependent on the position of the word itself in a given sentence to make a final output, right, to make a final sort of prediction, right. So multi-head attention basically allows you to get multiple combinations or multiple contexts associated with words or set of words in a given sentence, right. So all of these can be learnt in a fairly seamless fashion with multi-head attention. Okay, so any sort of large language model basically combines the transformer architecture with multi-head attention, and several stacks of encoder and decoder being put together, right. So that's how large language models are typically used for regular sort of language tasks. If you look at ChatGPT, it does a lot of things, right. So it can generate new information for you, it can help you in debugging, it can help you polish your language, also do some amount of translation and so on, right. So large language models can be quite powerful, and in the materials context this Crystal LLM is a very useful application of these large language model architectures, right. So Crystal LLM basically stands for Crystal Large Language Models, right, and these are models that are used for generating crystallographic information files or CIF files, right. So each CIF file basically encodes a structure, so it is structural information put into text form, right. So what these authors did was they used these LLM architectures where they mainly used only decoders, right, to train on these CIF files, and there were a collection of CIF files that were taken from a publicly available repository, right. So they trained these models, and these models then subsequently use auto-regressive techniques to generate structure, to generate structures. Basically they this Crystal LLM model generates text that is identical to a crystallographic information file or a CIF file, and you can, once you generate a CIF file, you basically have a structure in place, and you can pass on the structure to other models or other calculations, right, to get necessary properties. So there is some auto regression, they also use some Monte Carlo techniques to constrain their search to come up with reliable structure generation. And this structure generation can be done with text prompts. So you give very simple text prompts and then you get very nice structures from them, right. So Crystal LLM is a very nice application of how large language models can be used for structural generation using entirely text based inputs as well as text based prompts and outputs, right. So in our hands on session you will look at how to use Crystal LLM to output a simple structure for this compound lithium manganese oxide. You will see that you will see this kind of an output in your Jupyter notebook where you generate multiple different or multiple possible structures for your target composition. With that we will summarize this lecture on language models. So sequential data basically those that are based on text requires context and memory for models to be useful and for models to be predictive, and here is where conventional sort of neural networks fall short because they don't they cannot do many to many associations, so many inputs to many output associations in a very trivial fashion. Recurrent neural networks sort of solve some of these problems. So by persisting with information it can actually enable many to many mapping, but simple RNNs have problems with storing information or storing memory over longer sequences, which was partially solved by LSTM. But LSTM models since they do sequential processing, they also have memory and data set limitations, so they have transferability limitations, and all of these problems have been solved with the transformer architecture, which is what is used in modern large language models. And the heart of the transformer is basically attention, which tries to provide tries to capture context of any given word in a sentence. And we also saw how these large language models can be used in the context of crystallographic information files to generate structures. So these can be used in a generative context even within material science and materials engineering. With that we actually come to the conclusion of this course. So we saw in the last few lectures we saw some advanced topics ranging from interatomic potentials to transfer learning to diffusion and language models. In the previous module we saw density function theory being a tool to generate data, molecular dynamics to generate kinetic data, and also some physics based models which are still quite relevant to understand phase stability, kinetic behavior and so on of different materials. And in the very first module way back in the course we also looked at some classical models, neural networks, convolutions and graph networks, right, and how they can be useful in the context of materials. So with that I would like to part with some concluding thoughts. So designing better materials is crucial for several applications. Computations and AIML can be quite useful. There are different ways to do machine learning, and we saw several possible examples of doing machine learning within material science. But always keep in mind, if you are interested in using or developing models and also using many of these models, material science is always a data limited domain. Be careful what kind of data you use to train your models, whether you use real or synthetic data. What model to use, always try to start with simple models and then increase the complexity if simple models don't give you enough accuracy, and choose features carefully. So try to create models that are as physically intuitive as possible, right, and then don't do machine learning just because you can if you can build simpler models, those are always better. And construct models with care, make sure that you don't overfit models, and then do test and validate models very rigorously. And I would like to acknowledge the teaching assistants who also developed some of the hands-on sessions for this course, Shaugat Purohit, Javed Ahmaddar and Preetham Ghosh. So thanks a lot for their support. With that I thank you all for joining this course and for being a part of it in this iteration. I hope all of you learnt useful concepts, useful tools, useful techniques that will allow you to implement, construct and use machine learning models in your research, in your application, in your production runs and so on. So I hope this course has been a very good learning experience for all of you. With that I once again thank you all for joining this course, and I hope to see you all in a subsequent course that myself or ISE will offer on the NPTEL platform. So thank you all for joining.